the chamber was still a kind of tense silence that only comes when power thinks it has the upper hand. Judge Amul Thapar leaned forward, his voice sharp, carrying that unmistakable tone of entitlement, the sound of someone certain that his robe and gavel placed him above reproach. He spoke Jasmine Crockett's name with a pointed edge, each syllable loaded with condescension, as if daring her to flinch, as if expecting her to retreat into the shadows of authority. But Crockett did not move, her eyes fixed on him, steady and unshaken, even as he pressed the question again, this time louder, this time with the smugness of a man convinced the cameras would record his dominance for the evening news. Around the room, aides and staffers shifted uneasily. Phones hovered, ready to capture the viral moment everyone sensed was coming. And then came the insult, thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Thapar's words dripped with arrogance, attempting to frame her not as an equal participant, not as a leader elected by the people, but as someone who didn't belong in the halls of power. The jab was clear. She was being challenged, not on her ideas, not on her record, but on her very right to sit in that chair. Gasps rippled quietly through the audience. Eyes darted to Crockett, waiting for her response. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. Crockett sat in absolute composure, letting the weight of his arrogance hang heavy in the air. It was the silence before the storm, the pause before the lightning strike. Every viewer, whether in the room or behind a screen, leaned in just a little closer. Would she absorb the blow? Would she sidestep? Or would she rise? Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that said she had been here before, that she had endured far worse and had never once lost herself. In the face of it, the kind of smile that said the tables were about to turn, end, just as Judge Thapar prepared to double down. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice low, precise, carrying the power of generations who had fought to be heard. What she said next would not only pierce his facade, it would send shockwaves far beyond the chamber walls. Because this was no ordinary exchange. This was the moment when arrogance would meet its match. When silence would shatter into a clapback so sharp, the world would still be talking about it the next day. But to understand the full weight of what was about to happen, you first have to know why this clash mattered so deeply, not just for Crockett, but for America itself. What unfolded in that chamber was never just about one sharp exchange of words. It was about something larger, a clash that spoke directly to America's identity crisis. A confrontation that revealed, in raw form, the battle lines between dignity and arrogance, representation and exclusion, progress and the pull of regression. Judge Amul Thapar didn't simply come into that room with questions. He came with a posture, a projection of authority that relied on more than law. It leaned on an unspoken assumption that certain voices, certain faces, certain identities must prove themselves over and over again just to be taken seriously. That posture wasn't new. It was the same one that had followed countless leaders from underrepresented communities, designed to chip away at their credibility before they even spoke. And that day, in front of cameras and microphones, it set the stage for something far greater than a courtroom-style grilling. Because on the other side of that posture sat Jasmine Crockett, unapologetically herself, elected by people who knew her grit and unwilling to shrink just because power expected her to. Every glance she gave, every pause before she spoke, carried the quiet defiance of someone who had no intention of letting arrogance dictate the script. And it was this very dynamic that made the exchange impossible to ignore. For progressives watching, for immigrants who knew what it felt like to be told they didn't belong, for communities who had fought too long to see their leaders dismissed with a smirk, this wasn't just political theater, it was personal. The stakes were nothing less than whether truth could still hold its ground in a system designed to intimidate. And the tension built with each word. Thapar leaned harder, as if repetition could somehow break Crockett's resolve. His voice grew sharper, dripping with the kind of disdain that only reveals itself when the mask of neutrality slips. His intention was clear. He wanted the viral clip to be her stumble, her misstep, her flustered retreat under the weight of authority. But that's not what the cameras caught. Instead, they caught a woman who refused to blink, who knew that her composure alone could dismantle the very performance he was trying to stage. They caught the calm before her counterstrike, the rising energy in the room as the imbalance of power began to tilt. Even those who came expecting the judge to dominate started to sense the shift. The silence grew heavier, the anticipation sharper. Viewers at home felt it too. Social feeds lit up in real time, people typing furiously. Wait, is Crockett really about to go there? The moment became bigger than politics. It became a test of how far dignity could stretch in the face of arrogance, and whether arrogance could withstand the weight of its own overconfidence. And here's the truth. This was more than just about Jasmine Crockett or Amul Thapar. This was about the story of America itself, written in microcosm. Would the narrative continue to favor those who leaned on titles and old hierarchies? Or would it finally bend toward those who had earned their place by fighting, by serving, by speaking truth to power even when it was uncomfortable? Everyone watching knew they were seconds away from an answer. But what happened next didn't just flip the script, it detonated it. leaving the chamber, and soon the entire country in disbelief. To understand the full electricity of that moment, you have to know who Amyl Thapper is, and more importantly, what he represents. On paper, his resume gleams: a federal judge appointed by powerful conservative figures, a man cloaked in the authority of law, and someone often mentioned as a potential Supreme Court nominee. His path is framed as a story of prestige, of merit, of ascension into the highest corridors of influence. But when the spotlight swings closer, when the camera zooms past the robe and into the posture, a different picture begins to emerge. One not of impartial justice, but of entitlement sharpened into arrogance. Thapper has built a reputation for wielding his authority with precision, but also with a distinct sharpness that critics argue borders on hostility. In hearings, his questions are not always designed to uncover truth, but to corner, to trip, to dominate. He presents himself as the arbiter, the one above the fray. Yet the subtle disdain laced into his tone often tells a different story. Those who have sat across from him describe the experience as less about dialogue and more about spectacle, a performance where his role is the intellectual giant, and the other party is the presumptive fool. That arrogance has not gone unnoticed. In fact, it has become a signature, a calling card. In conservative circles, he is celebrated as tough, unyielding, the kind of judge who will not bend to political correctness. But outside those circles, especially among progressives and immigrant communities, he is seen as emblematic of the double standard, someone who projects an image of having earned his position, yet weaponizes that position to question whether others, especially women and people of color, belong in theirs. And this contradiction is what makes his role in this confrontation so stark. Here is a man of South Asian descent, himself the child of immigrants, who has risen through a system not built for him. One might expect empathy, recognition of the barriers faced by others like Jasmine Crockett. Instead, what the public often sees is alignment with the very powers that slam those barriers back into place. Too many, that makes his sharpness cut twice as deep, not just arrogance, but betrayal. His demeanor on the day of the clash followed that familiar pattern. From the moment he leaned forward, his eyes carried the confidence of someone who assumed the room was his to command. His phrasing was meticulous, his tone calibrated to sting. He wasn't asking questions in pursuit of clarity. He was building a trap, a rhetorical snare designed to humiliate. And why not? He had done it before, with others who lacked the presence to push back. He had grown used to watching his subjects wilt under the weight of his voice. Their hesitation captured on camera, their careers bruised in the aftermath. But arrogance, left unchecked, breeds blindness. And in that blindness, Thapper miscalculated. He saw Crockett not as a force but as a target. He mistook her calm for passivity, her silence for submission. What he didn't see, what he could not see through the fog of his own certainty, was that she was waiting, preparing, letting him dig the very pit he would soon tumble into. The contradictions in his posture became more glaring with each moment. He framed himself as the custodian of law, yet his tone betrayed bias. He claimed neutrality, yet his smirk revealed condescension. He demanded respect for his position, yet refused to extend even the minimum of it toward hers. For viewers, it was like watching a play unfold in slow motion. The villain puffing himself up, unaware that the act of puffing was the very thing sealing his downfall. And as he pressed forward, leaning heavier, raising his voice to emphasize authority, the chamber felt the imbalance tilt. It was no longer a question of whether he would overplay his hand, it was only a question of when. Even the allies who admired his toughness began to sense the danger in his approach. Too much pressure applied in the wrong place can trigger collapse. And that collapse was coming. The irony was inescapable. A judge who prided himself on control was about to lose it in the most public way possible. And the very woman he sought, to corner the one he believed would falter, was the one who would expose him. But to fully grasp why Jasmine Crockett's response would land with such seismic force, you have to understand who she is. You have to know the fire she carries, the battles she has fought, and the resilience that defines her every word. Because the story of this clash isn't just about a judge's arrogance. It's about how one woman's journey prepared her to dismantle it in real time. Before she ever sat in that chamber, before the cameras captured her poised stare and sharp retorts, Jasmine Crockett's story had already been written in resilience. She is not a politician who emerged from privilege or inherited pathways. She is a woman forged in the heat of struggle, shaped by the kind of obstacles that would have silenced someone less determined. To truly feel the power of her response, to Judge Thapper, you must understand the foundation that built her. A life lived at the intersection of hardship, identity, and unrelenting will. Crockett grew up knowing what it meant to be underestimated. She knew the dismissive looks, the subtle whispers, the quiet assumption that people who looked like her, people who carried her kind of fire, didn't belong in the most powerful rooms. She learned early that her voice would not be handed space. It would have to carve its own path. That carving began long before politics. In the courtroom, where she defended those whom the system sought to crush, where she pushed back against the machinery of injustice that tried to swallow ordinary people whole. Her journey into law was not simply ambition, it was necessity. In communities where systemic bias ran unchecked, she saw firsthand the devastation it left behind. Families torn apart, futures extinguished. In each case, each client etched a deeper sense of purpose into her. She was not just practicing law, she was practicing defiance. Standing in the gap between the powerless and the powerful, refusing to let the weight of the system go unanswered. That experience sharpened her instincts, teaching her to spot arrogance, to dissect contradictions, to never be intimidated by theatrics dressed up as authority. And so, when Crockett stepped into politics, she carried all of that with her, not as baggage, but as armor. Every insult she endured, every courtroom where she was underestimated, every door that tried to close in her face became another layer of steel. She wasn't interested in climbing ladders built for others. She was building ladders of her own, for herself and for those who would come after her. Her election was no accident. It was the result of grit meeting community, of authenticity meeting need. People rallied to her because they recognized in her the kind of honesty that cannot be faked. She didn't cloak her words in polite evasions. She didn't shrink to fit the expectations of others. She spoke plainly, passionately, and unapologetically about justice, representation, and dignity. For communities long ignored, Crockett became a mirror of their frustrations and their hopes. The embodiment of a promise that someone would finally fight without apology. That is what she carried into the confrontation with Judge Thapper. This was not just another politician trying to hold ground. This was a woman who had been battle-tested in courtrooms, in campaigns, in daily life. Her composure under his questioning was not some tactical trick. It was muscle memory, the practiced calm of someone who had been targeted before, who had heard every variation of dismissal and insult, and who had survived them all. And for viewers, especially those from immigrant backgrounds, communities of color, and progressive spaces, her presence meant more than representation. It meant reclamation. Every second she sat unshaken, every glance she held steady, told millions of people, you belong in these rooms too. That's why her smile, that subtle curl of knowing defiance, mattered so much. It wasn't just about clapping back at a judge. It was about carrying the weight of generations who had been told to sit down and proving, in real time, that standing tall was the only option. But Crockett's story also carried a different kind of fuel, a personal authenticity that set her apart from politicians who hide behind platitudes. She didn't just read about inequities, she lived them. She didn't just talk about the need for fairness, she embodied it in every case she took, every speech she gave, every confrontation she endured. That authenticity became her superpower. It was the reason she couldn't be rattled, the reason no insult could pierce her core. And this is what Judge Thapper failed to see. He believed his authority would be enough to tilt the balance. He believed that raising his voice, leaning on his title, and pressing harder would force her into the familiar posture of defense. But Crockett was not built for retreat. Her life had taught her the opposite lesson. That retreating only feeds arrogance, that silence only strengthens dismissal. So she waited, she calculated, and she prepared to strike not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been cornered in the same way. In that chamber, her presence was already victory. But what made the moment historic was that she was about to transform presence into power. She was about to take every ounce of her backstory, every courtroom battle, every campaign trail hardship, every ounce of identity pride, and channel it into one response that would ripple far beyond the hearing. The audience didn't know it yet. The judge certainly didn't know it. But Crockett knew. She had been waiting for this very kind of confrontation her entire career. And when the escalation came, when his arrogance pushed past its breaking point, she would be ready. Because if Judge Thapper represented the arrogance of a system that tries to corner its challengers, Jasmine Crockett represented the truth that refuses to be cornered. And when those two forces collided, the sparks would not only light up the chamber, they would ignite a firestorm across the country. The air inside the chamber grew heavier with each passing second, as though the walls themselves were absorbing. The tension radiating between the two figures, Judge Jaime Thapper leaned in once more, this time sharpening his tone into something almost accusatory. He had tried condescension, now he shifted toward dominance. The edge in his voice meant to rattle, to unnerve, to bend Jasmine Crockett into submission under the sheer weight of his authority. But Crockett did not flinch. She sat with the same composure that had carried her through every confrontation of her life. Her eyes never wavered, her posture never collapsed. If anything, her stillness became louder than his words. It was a silence that spoke volumes. A kind of restraint that made the chamber lean forward, waiting, sensing the inevitable storm that was building beneath her calm exterior. Thapper pressed again, repeating his question with even more force. Each syllable was crisp, deliberate, as if he believed the precision alone could puncture her armor. His hand cut through the air, punctuating his words with small aggressive gestures meant to underscore his authority. Staffers exchanged uneasy glances, reporters, pens scratched faster. Aware that this was no ordinary exchange, Crockett's expression never changed. She absorbed each verbal blow like stone absorbs the rain, acknowledging its presence, but never breaking under its impact. Her silence was not weakness. it was strategy. It was the patience of a woman who knew that timing is everything. That sometimes the most powerful answer is the one withheld until it can strike with maximum force. The judge grew restless. His confidence, so steady at the beginning, began to fray at the edges. He raised his voice, his tone tinged now with frustration. His words, once coded in smug precision, began to spill faster, betraying his irritation that his target refused to yield. In his mind, this should have been simple. Apply pressure, watch the crack form, and seize the moment for dominance. But Crockett's resolve refused to provide him the satisfaction. The chamber felt the shift. What had begun as a performance of power was slowly becoming a spectacle of overreach. Each new jab from Thapper seemed less controlled, more desperate, while Crockett's calm presence loomed larger, magnifying the contrast. It was the oldest dynamic in the book, arrogance trying to force submission, only to expose its own fragility. In the process, a murmur spread quietly through the room. Even those who had come to support Thapper sensed something was slipping. They watched as his questions became sharper but less effective, as his tone escalated but his authority diminished. The more he pushed, the more Crockett's silence carried weight. The more he postured, the more obvious his insecurity became. For Crockett, it was the perfect stage. She knew that letting him unravel was part of the strategy. Each unnecessary repetition, each sharpened tone, only deepened the pit he was digging for himself. All she had to do was wait for the exact moment when his arrogance crossed the invisible line between authority and desperation, and that moment was fast approaching. Thapper leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, before delivering one final attempt at cornering her. His words landed hard, sharpened into an unmistakable insinuation that her presence in this space, her voice in this debate, was somehow less legitimate. The jab hung in the air like smoke, bitter and undeniable. Gasps echoed softly through the audience. Crockett finally shifted. She leaned forward, her hands clasped gently, her eyes locked directly on his. It wasn't a sudden outburst or a defensive scramble. It was measured, deliberate, the kind of movement that signaled the beginning of something irreversible. The chamber stilled instantly. Even Thapper paused, sensing something he hadn't anticipated, control slipping from his grasp. Every camera, every pen, every watching eye knew what was about to happen. This was no longer a debate. It was a battle of presence, and Jasmine Crockett was about to seize it. The tension rose like a held breath. And in that silence, in that suspended moment where anticipation felt almost unbearable, the question was no longer whether she would answer, but how devastating her answer would be. Because the clapback was coming, and when it landed, it would shatter more than just Thapper's argument. It would shake the entire room, sending tremors far beyond the chamber walls. The silence was electric, the kind that prickles across the skin and makes every heartbeat sound louder than it should. Judge Thapper's last jab still hung in the air, but all eyes had already shifted to Jasmine Crockett. Her slight lean forward signaled the shift. The balance of power in the chamber, once tilted heavily toward the bench, was now teetering, waiting for her to claim it outright. She began softly, not with anger, not with panic, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows the strength of her truth. Her voice cut through the air with crisp clarity, low enough to force the room to lean in, strong enough to remind them she didn't need to shout to be heard. "Judge," she said, each word deliberate, "you've asked your question 3 times, and I'll answer it once the right way." The room froze. Even the reporters' pens hesitated. Thapper's eyes narrowed, expecting a stumble, perhaps a flimsy defense he could swat down with another wave of judicial condescension. But what followed was nothing short of a dismantling. Crockett didn't just respond to his question. She turned it inside out. She pointed out the flaw in his premise, exposing the loaded nature of his words with the precision of a practiced attorney and the heart of someone speaking for more than herself. Her sentences stacked like bricks, each one tightening the trap he thought he had set for her. With every pause, with every carefully chosen phrase, she forced him to sit in the discomfort of his own overreach. "You want to talk about legitimacy," she continued, her voice firming, rising in tempo. "Let's talk about what legitimacy really means. It's not about who you try to corner in this room. It's not about the robe you wear or the title you lean on. Legitimacy comes from the people, from the voters who sent me here, from the communities who fight every single day just to be seen." A low murmur rippled through the audience, the kind that signals an undeniable shift in energy. Thapper's jaw tightened. He had underestimated her, and now the world was watching that mistake unfold in real time. Crockett pressed on, the rhythm of her words growing sharper, more cutting. She called out the hypocrisy of using authority as a shield, laying bare the arrogance woven into his tone. "You don't get to decide who belongs in this space," she declared, her eyes never leaving his. "The people decide, and the people didn't ask me to shrink when faced with arrogance. They sent me here to stand." Gasps filled the chamber. For some, it was disbelief. For others, relief. The words they had longed to hear spoken to power were finally being delivered without hesitation, without apology, and Crockett wasn't finished. She shifted her focus, broadening the scope beyond the walls of the chamber. "This isn't just about me, Judge. This is about every person who's been told they're less than. Every immigrant who's been told to go back. Every woman who's been interrupted, dismissed, and belittled in rooms like this. Every young kid watching right now who wonders if they'll ever be taken seriously. I'm speaking for them too. At that, the murmurs erupted into audible affirmations. Heads nodded, whispers of yes carried through the room. Social media, already ablaze with live commentary, lit up like wildfire. Tweets, posts, and hashtags exploded in real time. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag stand with Jasmine. Hashtag dignity wins. Memes began forming even before she finished her statement. Screenshots of her poised expression spreading across feeds with captions celebrating her courage. Meanwhile, Thapper's composure slipped. He attempted to interject, to reclaim control, but Crockett anticipated the move. She raised her voice just slightly, enough to override his interruption without ever breaking her calm rhythm. It wasn't defiance for the sake of spectacle, it was precision, ensuring that his attempt to silence her only highlighted his desperation. And then came the line, the one destined for headlines. The mic drop moment that would echo far beyond the chamber. She locked eyes with him, her voice steady, her tone final. You may try to corner me, but the truth doesn't live in your corner. It lives here in my voice, in my people, in every space where dignity refuses to bow to arrogance. The room erupted. Some gasped. Others applauded softly before being hushed. But no one could deny the seismic weight of the moment. Thapper, visibly rattled, leaned back, his posture collapsing under the weight of what had just occurred. The authority he had wielded like a weapon now looked fragile, brittle, exposed. Crockett, on the other hand, sat back with measured calm. She had not raised her voice in anger, she had not lost control. She had simply, methodically, stripped his performance of its power and replaced it with her own. The chamber was buzzing, but the story was only beginning. Already, outside those walls, phones buzzed with notifications, timelines filled with clips. Commentators rushed to weigh in. What had just happened wasn't merely a heated exchange. It was the kind of moment that shapes narratives, that inspires movements, that reminds people why they tune in, why they vote, why they fight. And as Crockett's words echoed through the chamber, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer about Thapper's questions. This was about the ripple effect that would follow. Because when arrogance meets dignity, and dignity answers with precision and fire, the aftermath is never contained. It spreads, it grows. It transforms a single exchange into a cultural moment. The judge thought he had cornered her. Instead, he had opened the door for a response that would shake the country. And while the chamber reeled from the clash, the real explosion was just beginning out there. In the streets, on the feeds, in the voices of millions who had just witnessed Jasmine Crockett refuse to bow. The aftershocks were already on their way. And when they hit, they would leave no doubt about who had truly won the day. The chamber had barely settled before the moment began to reverberate beyond its walls. Phones lit up like fireworks, notifications, stacking faster than eyes could read them. What had just unfolded between Judge Amul Thapper and Jasmine Crockett was no longer confined to a congressional hearing. It had become fuel for a nationwide conversation. The clapback, sharp and unflinching, spread across social media in real time. A wave of digital energy surging from one platform to another. On Twitter, hashtags erupted within minutes. Hashtag Crockett, clapback, hashtag truth in that chamber, hashtag dignity over arrogance. Clips of her steady gaze and final devastating line flooded time. Some videos had racked up hundreds of thousands of views before the hearing even adjourned. One user captioned it simply, "This is how you talk back to power." Another wrote, "My kids are going to see Jasmine Crockett's courage tonight. Representation matters." Instagram Reels captured her calm composure, paired with booming background tracks, turning her words into cinematic snippets replayed on loop. On TikTok, young creators stitched the clip with their own commentary, faces lighting up as they repeated her words, adding, "That's how you handle arrogance." Even late-night comedians couldn't resist jumping in, pulling the footage into monologues that praised her courage while mocking Thapper's unraveling. News outlets scrambled to frame the story. Some headlines cast it as a heated exchange, others as a defining confrontation. But among progressive voices, the language was clear. Jasmine Crockett had delivered a moment of truth, one destined to resonate as a rallying cry. Panelists on political talk shows replayed the clip over and over, dissecting her words, marveling at her composure. Commentators noted the generational weight of what she had said, how it spoke not just to politics, but to dignity, identity, and belonging. In America. Meanwhile, in communities across the country, watch parties and neighborhood groups buzzed with pride. For immigrant families, the moment felt like vindication, a clear visual reminder that authority could be challenged, that voices once dismissed could rise and reshape the narrative. For young women of color, it was validation that strength and poise were not mutually exclusive, that fire could coexist with calm, and that representation meant more than just occupying a seat, it meant redefining it. And the ripple effects reached even further. Celebrities chimed in, sharing the clip with captions that amplified her message. Musicians quoted her words in posts that gathered millions of likes. Activists seized on the moment as proof that progress was alive, that the battle against arrogance and exclusion could still be won in the spotlight. Politicians on both sides weighed in, some praising her bravery, others scrambling to downplay the significance of her but the attempt to diminish the impact only fueled the viral momentum, drawing sharper contrasts between dignity and dismissal. Judge Thapper, once the dominant presence in that chamber, now found his name trending alongside Crockett's, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of being remembered as the arbiter of control, he was cast as the foil, the overreacher whose arrogance had backfired spectacularly. Memes painted him as the villain of the story, captions mocking his unraveling. Composure, when you realize you're not in control anymore. But the most powerful shockwave wasn't just digital, it was emotional. Across living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, people felt something stirred. Crockett's words became a vessel for their own frustrations, their own histories of being dismissed, underestimated, or cornered. Parents replayed the clip for their children, saying, "Look, this is what strength looks like. This is what representation sounds like." Young activists clipped it into highlight reels for rallies, projecting it on walls as a reminder that truth could still cut through noise. The story had transcended politics. It had become cultural currency, a shared reference point, a spark for conversations about who gets to belong in America's most powerful spaces. And as the momentum swelled, one truth became clear. Crockett's clapback was no longer just an isolated act of defiance. It was a symbol, a declaration that dignity, once voiced, could not be contained. And yet, even as the world celebrated her triumph, a deeper question emerged, lingering like smoke after a fire. What does this moment mean for the larger battle? Was this just a viral clash, destined to fade into tomorrow's headlines? Or could it become something greater, a lesson, a rallying cry, a turning point? That question would define the days ahead, because beyond the hashtags and applause, lay the heart of the story, the moral lesson that would either flicker or ignite into something lasting. And it was Jasmine Crockett herself who would give the answer. When the dust settled and the hashtags quieted into the rhythm of everyday conversation, the true meaning of what Jasmine Crockett had done came into focus. It wasn't just about the clapback itself, sharp, unforgettable, seared into the digital bloodstream of the nation. It was about the deeper message that echoed beneath her words. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Crockett's response stood as proof that presence is power. In a chamber designed to intimidate, in a space where titles and robes are meant to silence dissent, she had flipped a script. She reminded everyone watching that authority is not measured by tone or title, but by truth. And truth requires no permission to stand tall. Her refusal to bow, her insistence on answering with clarity and conviction, reframed the entire confrontation into something more universal. The lesson was clear. In a democracy, legitimacy is not owned by judges or lawmakers, not monopolized by institutions that cling to hierarchy. It flows from the people, the voters, the families, the communities whose struggles and triumphs form the backbone of the nation. Crockett didn't just defend herself against Thapper's jab. She elevated the moment into a declaration that representation cannot be cornered, that identity is not a weakness but a strength, and that arrogance collapses when confronted with unyielding dignity. For progressives, for immigrants, for women, for communities long marginalized, her stance carried the weight of validation. It said, "You do not need to ask permission to exist in these spaces. You do not need to apologize for your voice, your heritage, your presence. And when arrogance tries to corner you, your calm, your truth, your resilience will always speak louder, even beyond politics." The resonance was undeniable. Teachers replayed her words in classrooms, connecting them to lessons about civic engagement. Faith leaders quoted her in sermons about courage. Activists incorporated her lines into chants at rallies, turning her defiance into collective empowerment. In living rooms across the country, families nodded with pride, whispering to children, "See, that's how you carry yourself when the world tries to push you down." And for Crockett herself, the moment wasn't simply about winning an argument. It was about showing what leadership looks like. Not bluster, not arrogance, but strength rooted in service and authenticity. She embodied the kind of leadership America desperately craves. Leadership that doesn't shrink in the face of hostility. Leadership that stands tall not just for itself, but for the millions who see themselves reflected in it. Her confrontation with Thapper crystallized a truth many had long felt but rarely saw, displayed so vividly that dignity, even when underestimated, has the power to shake foundations. That arrogance, no matter how loud, eventually unravels under the weight of its own emptiness. And that the true measure of America lies not in who can shout the loudest, but in who can stand the tallest without losing their humanity. As the story rippled through the nation, it invited reflection. What kind of country do we want to be? One where authority corners and belittles, or one where voices rise from every background, carrying truths that cannot be ignored? Crockett's answer was clear, and it resonated beyond partisan lines. It reminded people that the fight for justice is not abstract. It happens in rooms like that chamber, in moments like that exchange, where courage collides with arrogance and reshapes the narrative. And perhaps that is why the moment will endure, because it was never just about Crockett shutting down a judge. It was about the universal triumph of dignity over dismissal, of truth over spectacle, of the people's voice over the arrogance of power. But even as the moral clarity settled in, the story was not finished. For every great confrontation, for every cinematic climax, there must be a closing act, one that ties the lesson to action, one that transforms inspiration into momentum. The question was no longer whether Crockett had won the exchange. That was beyond doubt. The question now was how her victory would live on, how her words would echo into the choices of those watching. And that's where the final chapter begins. In the end, what began as Judge Thapper's attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett will forever be remembered as the moment she turned arrogance into rubble and stood as a symbol of unshakable dignity. The clash was never really about the specifics of a question. It was about who holds the power to define legitimacy, and Crockett made it clear that legitimacy lives in the people, not in titles or smug performances. Her calm precision, her unflinching voice, her refusal to bow, all of it combined into a scene that will echo for years. Viewers didn't just see a politician holding her ground. They saw themselves, their communities, their struggles reflected in her defiance. She showed that when arrogance tries to corner you, you don't shrink. You rise, you reclaim the space, you redefine the terms. That is why this moment matters. Far beyond one chamber, one judge, one exchange. It matters because it reminds us of who we are and who we can be. A country that honors dignity over condescension. A people who recognize that truth doesn't come from intimidation, but from courage. So if you felt that surge of pride watching Jasmine Crockett dismantle arrogance, if you felt validated in your own battles to be heard, then don't let this moment fade into tomorrow's noise. Share it, talk about it, carry it forward. Because every voice that amplifies her courage strengthens the chorus of dignity rising against arrogance everywhere. Subscribe, stay with us, and be part of this movement, not just as spectators, but as participants. Together we can ensure that moments like this don't just inspire us for a night, but light the path toward a future where justice and truth always have the last word.